Hi, and welcome to The Comparable, the series in which each episode spotlights two companies building similarly in two different emerging markets. Unlike our regular format in which we interview two founders, this episode will be doing something we call the Comparable Compact, a shorter or somewhat shorter episode that dives deeper with one founder or one investor. Last season, we did this a few times with episodes with Alex Lazaro from Fluent Ventures and Dina El-Shanufi from F6 Ventures. In this episode of the Comparable Compact, I'm excited to have Pedro Arnt, CEO of dLocal, one of the most well-known global payments companies for emerging markets in the world. dLocal was born out of Uruguay in 2016 with the vision to close the payments innovations gap between international businesses and emerging economies. And over the past 10 years, the company grew to reach unicorn status in 2020, went public on the NASDAQ in 2021, and now works across the world in 60 countries, with operations in over 44 of those countries with over 1,000 payment methods. As the company grew and went public, it saw a leadership transition from its original founders, with Pedro Arnt, our guest today, brought in 2023, first as co-CEO and then later fully as CEO to lead the company in this new chapter. In this episode, you'll hear more about this transition, how dLocal has grown and evolved over its lifespan and under Pedro's leadership, what they've learned working across emerging markets, and what fintech founders in these economies can learn from this really incredible case study. Let's get into it. Our guest today is Pedro Arnt, the CEO of dLocal, one of the most important payments infrastructure companies connecting global merchants to emerging markets. Before joining dLocal as CEO in 2023, Pedro spent more than 2 decades in Mercado Libre, where he helped scale one of Latin America's most iconic technology companies. It's an honor to have him here, so welcome to the show, Pedro. I want to first start with a little bit about your own background because it is interesting. You began your career at Boston Consulting Group, but then spent over 2 decades at Mercado Libre, the largest e-commerce platform in LATAM, with your last 12 years there as CFO. And I think it's really important, right? Because you were at this company at its really important growth point. And I know it's hard to distill 2 decades into just a couple lessons, but if you were to take your time there and put it into 2 or 3 major lessons for founders in emerging markets, what would they be?
You're spot on, right? I think there are many more things we did wrong that I would encourage others to not repeat. But I think it's also the things that were done right there that maybe made the most difference. And so I'll string out perhaps a few of the most relevant for this conversation. The first one, and maybe we're going to invent a term here, but it's product market tropicalization. And I think what we meant by that was, I think we realized very quickly we were doing e-commerce, right? And you had global companies that you could look to learn a lot from. And one of the things that I think the entire team there was very good at was to stay very much in tune with what was going on globally, but an understanding that first principles were very similar that we were trying to solve around what the friction points and the pain points were in e-commerce, but that the real success came from being able to understand the first principles, which were replicable across global digital players that we were learning from and copying from, but then how you adapted that to the local market realities is what really made the difference. And I always those guys have been phenomenal in how they've continued to outperform and hold ground, for example, against Amazon, against the large Chinese incumbents. And for the longest time, I remember how the knee-jerk reaction was, well, Melly will do well until Amazon decides to arrive or until the Chinese players arrive. And that really hasn't happened. And I think one key to their success there has been that ability to really understand their local markets and to bring those first principle solutions that are quite global, but then really adapt them for the reality of each one of the markets they operated in a way that others that weren't born there and spent their entire lives building there were able to do. So there is an element here, and I don't think this applies to all business models, but many, many business models today do have an important local component. So if you really understand what that localization effect is and you really own it in your market, I think that positions you very well to hold off global incumbents when they try to gain territory into your markets. So yeah, product market tropicalization. There's a second one, which is way more generic, but I really think it applies, which is that company was always focused on the long term and had an uncanny ability to be very pragmatic in understanding that the long run was a series of small decisions and small steps, but always guided by that long-term vision, that long-term ambition. And there was really not that much corner cutting or taking shortcuts to solve a short-term pain point, but actually what really builds the best product and what seems to be the most winning strategy, taking a 10-year view, and then let's go and pursue that. And that's how they ended up getting into logistics, how they ended up getting into financial services to solve all the payments friction points that existed. I don't think you would have ever done that if you were just trying to optimize your business and your P&L for the next 12 months sprint.
I think you mentioned it's a generic lesson, but I actually think it's a really important reminder because I think founders can feel like they're constantly just firefighting. So sometimes it's easy to lose sight of that long term. So I do think that that's an important lesson. Shifting gears here, you joined dLocal in 2023, first as co-CEO with Sebastian Kanovich, who previously held the role of CEO since the founding of the company since 2016. In March of 2024, you stepped fully into the CEO role with Sebastian transitioning onto the board. And, I think we often, we talk about like people joining and why, and I think you've been asked on many podcasts, like why you decided to join dLocal when you did, but I actually want to dig a little bit into that leadership transition because that's sometimes like the chewy part of a company's journey that we don't really get the behind the scenes of, right? So, this also the leadership transition came on the heels of dLocal becoming a publicly listed company in 2021. And obviously would love to learn about why you decided to join dLocal at that like clear inflection point in the company, but also what was that transition like? Why did you feel it was important? What did you feel it was important to retain in the company culture from its previous leadership? And, being at the helm of a public company is such a different beast. And so what was important for you to shift as a leader of a company in this new growth period that dLocal was entering when you became CEO?
Great questions. I think you've gone to some of the most interesting, things I've learned over the past 2 years. Almost like when I zoom out and just observe myself as if I were an academic looking at everything I'm going through. So lots to chew on. Let me start with the first piece, okay? We've always heard why CEO transitions are so difficult, but I don't think until you're in the middle of one, you realize how massively difficult they are, right? And even more so if you're bringing an outside CEO. Like, I really encourage founders who think that they're not going to want to sit at the CEO helm throughout the entire journey of their companies, like build your successor from within. Because otherwise, the joke I make recently, it's you're almost lobotomizing a company. And there's a reason lobotomies don't work in medicine. You can't like take out one brain and put in another brain and the body still functions. And it's literally almost that challenging, right? And so that transition model that we came up with, if you're going to have to hire from outside, is one that I actually think works. And I'd say it works in the way we did it, that I was able to observe Seba. Seba was able to observe me. I think there was more of that because he was very good at really taking a step aside and letting me gradually take things over. But you could feel out that it was going to work or it wasn't going to work. And he could course correct when there were things that he thought maybe were worth intervening in to tell me that probably I should do them differently. So that mutual observing and mutual learning really helps. Now, you could also say it works in a different direction. Whenever I say this, people tell me, well, yeah, Benioff's tried that twice at Salesforce, and both times it ended up in him kicking out the potential successor, right? But maybe that's good, because if it's not going to work, you might as well rip out the Band-Aid earlier on. And then on the culture piece, that has been by far the most difficult and the most challenging part of the transition. Because two reasons. I think you hit on one of them during the question, which is, I do think in regulated markets like financials and across the globe, more than maybe in other digital experiences, that concept of what got us here doesn't get us there really applies. Because your initial days have to be about growth and speed and scale, because it's a very scale sensitive business. The problem is once you get to that scale, a lot of things begin to happen. You come under the eye of the regulator. You start becoming systemically somewhat more relevant. And therefore, you do need to change some things in the organization. But you typically don't have a burning bridge platform where the organization is going to crap. And so it's very easy to say either we change or we die. You're inheriting a highly successful organization that's gotten to where it's got. It's done amazing things. And you kind of have to jig the culture to tell it, you know what? It's working, but it ain't going to work anymore. And therefore we need to change it. And that has been unbelievably challenging. And I think the way you have to go about it is a combination of a lot of clear communication and narrative. For better or worse, it requires mixing the existing crew with new hires that you bring in, that you have to choose very carefully, because again, you have to bring to adjust culture, but you can't bring things that are completely contrary to the prior culture. And we've made some mistakes there, I think, and learned quickly. And at the end of the day, it's how do you keep the aspects that you think have been critical? So merchant focus in our case, speed of execution, really, really intelligent risk managers. We're managing money in parts of the world where if you try to do everything like you would do it in Switzerland, it doesn't work because the regulations are very different in other markets. But if you run afoul of the regulator, you're in trouble as well. So how do you manage risk incredibly well? Those are the things you need to keep. And then the things you need to add on is you need everyone to understand our license portfolio is growing. We come under the oversight of over 30 regulators now. We're a publicly listed company. So for better or worse, we'd love to be able to act as a startup forever, but we can't. There are processes, there are mechanisms, there are elements of a regulated industry that will slow us down a little bit. And our job is to figure out how to do them without becoming stodgy and slow in a traditional financial institution. Now, the cool thing is when you are able to combine both of those things, the merchant robustness and reputation that being highly licensed and regulated gives you. So when we're selling to our global Fortune 500 merchants, they know that they are outsourcing financial infrastructure to a regulated licensed entity. And at the same time, if we're faster and more nimble and more intelligent than the traditional stodgy regulated entity, then you've hit a really powerful combination of scale, licensing portfolio, which is a differential IP, and you're better and faster than the competitors that hold that scale and licensing asset base that you do. And that's when things, I think, really reach escape velocity. So that's where we feel we are right now.
It's a really, I mean, you came in at, it's so interesting to me, right? Because even as an early stage investor, I've noticed this with the companies that we've invested in that are at their A and B rounds now and at their B. And it's like, the founders that took you to that stage are obviously amazing, but sometimes they're not the right people to get you to that next stage. But it's also very emotional. It's a very emotional decision for a founder to let go. And for you coming in, I'm sure it must have felt very daunting in some ways because you're just like, you have to figure out a way to make this work if you're going to stay there. And at the same time, allow space and grace for that person to be able to step back. Why was then, for you, that timing was really interesting, especially given what you had done at Mercado Libre. Why was that point really interesting for you to step in?
I agree with everything you said. It was made very easy for me. In that sense, really kudos to Seb and to the entire founding team. They knew what they wanted. They had made up their mind and they made it extremely easy for me. And I hear all the stories about other attempts even successful attempts where you coexist with the founder, but you can see it's really hard for the founder to let go. That was not the case here. Now I do think prior timing was good. There's two reasons I think that a founder decides to transition. He realizes it's not something that he does well, or he realizes it's not something he wants to do. I think when they realize it's not something they want to do, it's a lot easier, because genuinely then you're both 100% vested in making the transition successful. Whereas when it's, I've been told by my board that maybe I should bring someone in, then that founder isn't really vested in that transition. Clearly here we were of the latter part. And so we were both all in making this work.
Yeah, great case study for other founders, maybe going through something similar, or will go through something similar. For you guys now, dLocal has grown considerably, obviously, like over the years, but even since going public. You guys now have operations in over 44 countries across emerging markets. And, there's a lot that's similar about emerging markets. That's kind of the point of this podcast, The Comparable. But there's also key differences, which might lead to when you enter a country, how you enter a country. How do you and your team think about market entry? And what are the key things that you look for from a timing perspective of why you might enter and when? And, I know that, you guys obviously operate in Pakistan. As a disclaimer, you work with one of my portfolio companies, SafePay. How do you find those right partners on the ground?
Yeah. So this is why I think I got so excited when you told me about your podcast, because in a way, there's a whole focus here on one of the things about dLocal that's fascinated me the most since I joined. So I'm going to be even more long-winded in this answer, I think. But first of all, we're a very unique, I think, breed of companies, and there isn't really a name for what we are yet, but we're this massive multinational, but that only does the global south, right? The number of countries we can offer financial infrastructure for is now up to 60 plus, right? So we really span pretty much. There's 2 or 3 countries that we are ever asked about that we don't offer, and we're soon going to be offering those as well, right? And yet we do 0 developed markets. Right? Actually, we do 1, and that's Japan, but that's because Japan's market structure in payments looks more like an emerging market. And you typically don't see that. You see a global company that at one point says, well, I'm going to go after developed markets because that's a larger market. Not us. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that, and I think this is, it's not perchance. There is a reason behind this, but it's that the structure of financial infrastructure and payments across emerging markets is remarkably similar. It's fragmented. It's coming off of periods of long pushes for financial inclusion through fintechs and digital startups. It typically has legacy card acquirers and not that much card penetration. It typically has banks that are not necessarily the most digitally savvy. And so that concoction is really similar, whether you're looking at Ecuador or Brazil or Nigeria or Egypt or Pakistan or Philippines or Vietnam. And that was part of the insight behind dLocal, is when the founders realized we're solving these pain points for global companies throughout Latin America. And when we got on a plane and we went to Pakistan or we went to China or we went to Nigeria, we interviewed people and we realized that there were significant commonalities behind what needed to get solved. And then when we spoke to our merchants, that got confirmed. They were feeling the exact same pain points across different parts of the global south. And so different members of the team hopped on different planes. Some went to Africa, some went to the Middle East, some went to Southeast Asia. And they basically start building out what were these capabilities, which takes us to the second part of your question, right? Which is, how did you guys build piping across 60 markets over the course of really 4 or 5 years? Because that's when the big internationalization push began. And I do think there's a replicable model here that we figured out, which is a big part of our success, which is whereas the traditional tech founder ethos and the traditional, I think, Silicon Valley ethos, and even if I look at the payments companies I admire the most globally, the Stripes, the Adians of the world, there are these real vertical integrations where the success factor was building better technology and building better product than the incumbents. And that build was usually a vertical build where I try to own the entire stack. So that is the correct key success factors for winning in payments in the developed world.
I was just thinking because when we were talking about the when piece of it, right? Because I do think things are replicable, but to the point of even of Pakistan, right? 5 years ago, the state bank regulations were actually it made it very difficult for players to come into the fintech space. That's obviously lowered. And now, with digital public infrastructure being rolled out, with our instant payment system going live, how much of the when of those types of factors matter for you?
What we figured out really quickly in the emerging world is it's super fragmented. There are many different ways consumers want to pay. They want to pay with cash. They want to pay with local wallets. There are many real-time networks that are emerging. So you can't build all these verticals, right? And so you need to think of yourself differently. Your product and your successful technology is more of a horizontal layer. So you're really middleware in a way that abstracts away the complexity for the global merchant that integrates into your API. And that has to be incredibly robust and solid. And then underneath, you're abstracting away from the merchant all the complexity, all the fragmentation that exists. And so that when is very much informed by, hey, we know there's interest in a market. Let's send the scout team to the market. There used to be a part of the organization called expansion. They would arrive, and basically what they'd start doing is talking to regulators, talking to banks, talking to fintechs primarily. And what we needed to find was the right combination of partners who we felt we could integrate into quickly, who kind of spoke our same language in terms of all the fixing and the iterations that would have to occur. If your only option was a 100-year-old emerging market bank, then you'd probably say not the right time, because every time I ask these guys for a fix, it's going to be a 6-month product pipeline because I'm not relevant to them. If I find the right fintech that shares that joint vision with me of how interesting would it be if we can build the rails so that Netflix, so that Spotify, so that Google will want to localize payments, then the right partner set is there. And a lot of what we built initially is through these partners. Then as a market matures and as a market grows, we'll expand the number of partners. We may choose that there are some payment methods that we want to go direct into. But that's essentially why we're able to give you a new market so quickly, because we're really just integrating into the existing infrastructure. And what we've gotten incredibly good at is how do you integrate quickly? How do you integrate efficiently? And how do you work with all those partners to fix all the kinks and problems that will emerge when you eventually start pushing traffic from these very distinct use cases, ride hailing, food delivery, e-commerce. All of these have very different payments realities, but we've done this so many times over and over again that we've actually gotten quite good at this. Before we launch a merchant in a new market, sometimes we do a pre-mortem, and it's amazing how the pre-mortems are like, oh, wow, look, I've messed up in 20 different markets. I know exactly what the problems might be. I can really try to get ahead of this.
Yeah, and you guys release a lot of research and playbooks almost, and it's really fascinating to read some of the case studies and just some of generally some of the takeaways that you guys have had. I think is super useful for those of us operating more locally in some of these markets. You were talking about Japan, which I thought was so interesting that their payment structures actually operate almost like emerging markets. But to this part of the question, which market or region has taught you the most about the complexity of local payment infrastructure?
Yeah. Africa has been fascinating, right? I mean, LATAM has some markets that are complex, but Africa has by far been the most fascinating because it's probably at an earlier stage in terms of the quality of the technology infrastructure. The size of the opportunity is massive. The regulatory frameworks are probably also the most dynamic and changing. And so I think if you can figure out Africa, if you can operate successfully in Africa, you've really probably developed some really significantly useful ways of working for the rest of the global south.
Yeah, and I think Africa is such a beast because it's, so much nuance that exists even within each region. So I think it's figuring that out is
Correct.
difficult.
There is no one Africa. That's absolutely true.
Yeah,
there are many different.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of African companies in the first season of this podcast, and it's always fascinating to hear just some of the nuances of even growing from within West Africa, how different countries can be. You were talking about culture at Mercado Libre and the things that you learn, and then also just the transition of yourself as a CEO of dLocal and things that you came into. In past interviews, and I've listened to a lot of your podcasts recently in preparation for this, you've talked about, hiring, the value of honest feedback. I think what's really interesting, given how spread out you guys are across the world, and obviously, you have presence in all these countries. As you mentioned, you also have the opportunity, you work with even more than that. How do you build a high-performing team across very different geographies? What are the things that are kind of the through lines for you guys from a culture perspective?
Again, super challenging, which is almost a way of saying this is one that we're still figuring out. And I think, but because we're still figuring it out, we've spent a lot of headspace on it, and we're learning. A couple of thoughts. I think that the reason this concept of honest feedback comes up, and I try to not be very big on cultural explanations, but that's because for the longest time I was living within a Latin American company where the distinctions were, Colombians are different to Mexico's. And my reaction was always like, it's border, I don't know. Now I really have appreciated that when managing human capital, culture is very relevant, because now we span, 60 markets, over 40 markets with people on the ground. And there you do have to be aware and cognizant of cultural distinctions. And one area where this comes up a lot is that most cultures, including Latino culture, are less direct than American culture, or certainly like Germanic culture, right? The concept of, hey, it's business, don't take it personally, doesn't always port that well. But on the other hand, I don't really see how you can build high-functioning teams if you don't have the ability to tell it to each other exactly like it is. So how do we navigate that cultural displeasure for being very direct, being very straight, or, I don't want people to respect hierarchy, because so many times the best idea has come from a team member that wasn't the most senior person on the team. And that's been a tough one. And so you can't just say, like you would say maybe in a US company, we're really tough on each other and we tell it like it is. So I think a concept like honesty, truth is maybe a key to try to get people to start becoming more comfortable with saying, look, when you're in your workspace here, we want to foster a space where people just tell it like it is, right? We don't want corporate athletes. We don't want people that are only showing what they're doing well. We want a culture where everyone brings what they're not doing well, and where others are invited to both congratulate you, but also call you out when you're not holding up your end of the bargain and it's affecting them. And then on tips to build high performing teams across countries, I think there's one very simple rule that probably trumps everything else, which is, and even prior to dLocal, I used to observe this a lot just working with the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Usually when you're going to expand into a new country, the first hire you make is your first person there, call it a country manager, whatever it is. But typically the problem you have is you have zero employee equity in that new market. So it's really hard for you to find the right person, right? But what usually kicks in is, we all know it, A players hire people better than themselves, B players hire people slightly worse than themselves, and C players hire people way worse than themselves. So if you don't put in the time to really get that very first hire really well, usually what happens is you end up with a B player hiring a C player, and then a year into it, you're going back to your board and saying, hey, you know what, the Brazil expansion isn't working. We hired the wrong person. We're back to square zero. If you take the time to really nail that first hire in that country, then you have a positive cycle. And I kind of see that a little bit with dLocal. The markets that maybe the expansion have been the smoother are typically ones that have the strongest country manager or initial lead in the market. So put in the necessary time. And I know time is your most scarce resource, but get that first person in each market really right, because you will save yourselves a load of pain down the road.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were talking, I was reflecting on I've been working in Pakistan for 15 years. So before I started investing, and I think what I realized, because everything that you said resonated so much, and it's also so countercultural from a norm perspective, right? It's not that people don't want to be more direct or have more honest feedback. It's just they haven't been raised that way. That's not the way that it feels like what the cultural norms are. But often I would discover that, like, at least for me, because I was mostly on the ecosystem building side for so long, that I would discover that going to places where people like were TEDx organizers or were like startup weekend people, like that type of community builder was like a very important profile in how I built my organization before. And I'm curious for dLocal, like sourcing those people are really important. Like, what's the through line in terms of that profile of person for you guys?
Yeah. So it's so funny you'd say that. I mean, I think for us, typically, one incredible resource has always been the Endeavor network, right? The other, I think we've learned about our country managers is there's this thing where you think, okay, we're going to open this market. We're going to pursue a license. We have to be regulated. So we need to find this, tried and tested professional who's dealt with the regulator. And those don't work out in our type of company. The ones that work out are the ones that were entrepreneurs at one point or another. So I can think of one market where we went to like 3 failed country managers. And the final one, we found him through the Endeavor network. And it's night and day, right? Because it's someone who just speaks the same language, understands the speed, the directness, understands building versus managing. So it's so interesting you'd say that. For us, Endeavor and Endeavor-like networks, which are usually focused on entrepreneurship, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the entrepreneur. Sometimes it's the mentors of the ecosystem, but still it's people that tend to gravitate towards
they're bought in
stage.
Yeah, they're bought into it already. Maybe Endeavor should start charging a finder's fee for everyone that you find. Yeah. So one thing I want to kind of wrap up this great interview. Thank you so much for your time today. But as a zoom out on fintech in emerging economies, it's fintech everywhere, but in emerging markets, it's evolving so fast today, especially with the emergence of, all the buzzwords, stable coins. People are leveraging tokenized debt and blockchain, the obvious growth and omnipresence of AI coming up everywhere and more. I know dLocal has expanded your product lines. What's exciting for you guys right now at dLocal? What do you think is overhyped? And what do you wish more people were thinking about today?
Yeah. Great. So look, I think the most exciting things for us is the emergence of non-card rails across so many corners, primarily of the emerging world. And non-card rails take on different flavors in different parts of the world. Southeast Asia is very much dominated by digital wallets and the Ant digital wallets, right? LATAM, you're seeing a lot happening on actual real-time network rails, whether it's Pix or Breve. India, it's UPI. You have other markets where it may be some local, closed system, but that's gained massive adoption in a specific market. So just the proliferation of different payment mechanisms, which aren't entirely interoperable yet, but I think soon will become interoperable, is amazing, because I think that allows you to see a future of a cheaper, faster, more open and more democratic set of rails to what credit cards have traditionally been, right? So that's exactly what local payment methods mean to me. And it's incredible. There's about, I think, something like 38 or more real-time ACH transfer protocols being built across the world, mimicking UPI and Pix, which are the two massive success stories, right? So that's super interesting. Stable coins are massively interesting. I think we're not really sure how it's going to play out. I'm increasingly thinking that stablecoin, I think the analogy I heard that I kind of like is a little bit like maybe the cloud. No one runs on-prem anymore, almost, but it didn't necessarily massively change who the winners or losers were. It simply changed what the underlying infrastructure through which we run our digital businesses became. Like, it's still Netflix, it's still whoever, Amazon, it's still Mercado Libre, it's still Alibaba, but now they all run on the cloud, which is way more efficient and more effective. And I think that's the direction we'll go with stable. Blockchain is so much better to program on. It has all sorts of benefits that I think incumbents will come to embrace. So that's why we've leaned into it so much. I don't think it necessarily fundamentally changes our relationships with our merchants, our positioning, but it does provide us with better infrastructure to move money around the world. And then on overhyped, I'm going to be very careful, okay? Because it's not that I think it's overhyped. I think AI is probably the most relevant revolution humanity has ever faced. But I think these early stages of understanding something that's so profoundly transformative is what I'm a little bit critical of. So I think somehow AI has sucked away all the interest from investors, from everyone else, as if there was nothing else interesting going on, and as if almost every other vertical, which isn't a clear AI winner, is an AI loser. And I actually think the reality will be way more nuanced than that. Payments to me is a clear corner of the world where AI will be transformative in cost structures. It'll be transformative in productivity of engineers to build better payments products, to build quicker on behalf of our merchants. But I don't yet see AI as something that basically does away with the need for payment rails. All these payment rails we've been talking about. So it's not that it's overhyped. It's probably underhyped. I don't think we realize what's about to hit us yet. But somehow, even being underhyped, it's just sucked up so much of everyone's attention that to me is a little bit of excessive hype.
Yeah, I think I 100% agree with that. I just got back from the Bay Area on Sunday, and that was what I was saying. I was like, there are other problems to solve in the rest of the world, and it won't be AI necessarily, or AI will be the means to the end, but it's not the end all be all of everything. The last part of the question is, what do you wish more people were thinking about today?
Yeah. So I'll come back to an AI one, and this has nothing to do with our business. It doesn't really have to do with the ecosystems we're building, but it has to do with the societies we're in. And it goes back to AI. I think the debate around what does the labor market look like in the direction we're going deserves more time, more nuanced, and more really intelligent people than me participating in, because I think we're falling into like these two really oversimplified camps, which is me, the doomsdayers, saying, we really need to figure this out, or that very basic concept of, every revolution ends up creating new jobs in roughly the same number as it destroys. And I don't think this one, from everything I'm seeing, has that tenor to it. So as a society, there's a lot of things we need to figure out. And I think we need to figure them out quickly, especially on the government side. Like, how are governments going to react to the pace at which this is going to hit them? And I just don't see that debate going on in the private sector, and so let alone in the public sector. And that's beginning to concern me more and more, because the more I look at dLocal and the more I look at how transformative it can be to our cost structure, and I'm meaning headcount, that question really pops up in the back of my mind.
Yeah. And I mean, to your point, there's so much that's so deeply human about the implications of this, right? And I'm like you, I'm like, are we thinking about that as much as we should? I think that's what it boils down to. But I've taken up a lot of your time today, Pedro. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us here. There were so many great nuggets and insights, and I'm sure so many people are going to learn so much from this episode. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fun.
that's it for this episode of The Comparable. I hope you enjoyed the format of the Comparable Compact. I always think it's really helpful to be able to get a sense of going deeper with one company, and something like dLocal, which has touched so many countries and so many emerging economies. And as I mentioned in the episode, our portfolio company, SafePay, is a partner of theirs. I've looked to them constantly as like this really great gold standard of like, how do you scale across emerging markets? And I really loved hearing Pedro's really honest takes on leadership transitions, because I think it's so rarely spoken about of, how often are the founders that start the companies the ones who should be there when it grows? And I think it takes a lot of it just takes a lot of maturity for the dLocal founders, Sebastian specifically, who was the original CEO, to make the decision to step back and to allow for new leadership to come in, and for Pedro to be, to do it with as much grace as he did, right? And to really think through it intentionally, especially with his background in Mercado Libre. I think all of those things kind of provide a really great playbook for folks that are looking to not only build fintechs in emerging markets, but to scale companies. And how do you do that? And how do you build for not just the 1 to 10 or the 10 to 100, but the 100 to 1,000? As an early stage investor, that's something I think about often. And I really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed being part of it. Talk to you next time. Bye.